Good morning. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to this group. I've had a lot of admiration for Dr. Vasquez and his staff for putting together a world conference like this. It's a real pleasure for me just to be able to walk into it and do my thing. So Alex, thank you so much. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The talk I'm going to be giving is based on a paper our research group published in 2005, and to say the least, I've got a little bit of mileage out of this paper. I've been all over the world, and it's a topic that I think many people are very much interested in. So, anytime we're talking about the origins and evolution of the Western diet, what we're really talking about are the origins of humanity itself. And what I'd like to do is walk you through this slide and talk about some of the key points here. So the first notion that I want to bring up is the idea of what is a hominin. A hominin is a bipedal ape, or an ape that walks upright. And if we look at the archaeologic record, actually the bones themselves, what we find is that there's perhaps 22 or even more species of hominins that have existed since the divergence of hominins with apes. And so if you look down here, the way this chart is set up is that this is the time frame in millions of years, and the earliest hominins, and these may have been pongids or apes, appear in the fossil record between 5 and 6 million years ago. And so mitochondrial DNA evidence as well as nuclear DNA evidence supports the archaeologic evidence that that was a split between pongids, apes that walked on all fours, versus ourselves that walk on two. And so as you move through this, there's a couple of key points here. This is a period called the Pliocene, and the Pliocene started about 5 million years ago, ended about 1.7 million years ago. And this is really when a lot of the action occurred, when we have all the speciation. And so each one of these rectangular boxes represents a species of hominins. And as we move from the green, the lower right-hand corner, up to the very top, here's our own species, Homo sapiens, which appear in the archaeologic record about 200,000 years ago, and that's corroborated by the mitochondrial DNA evidence as well as the nuclear DNA evidence. We are the only living hominids, and the action really got going, and this is what we'll be talking about in the next hour or so. The action really got going from the Pleistocene onward, and that's when the very first members of our genus Homo appeared. So let's take a look and see what we... one other final point. There was no universal, quote-unquote, paleo diet, okay? So there was all kinds of variations of this dependent upon the species, their ecologic niche, the season of the year, geographic location, everything. And so I think that kind of enters into the equation with modern-day paleo diets, is there's really no single version of this. All right, so what do we know about that Plio-Pleistocene period? What were they eating? We know that all species of hominids were eating both plants and animals, so they had an omnivorous diet. And this is kind of a cool slide in that the photographs that were taken here were taken in the late 60s and early 70s by an anthropologist by the name of Richard Lee in Botswana. And so here we have a woman, and you can see these are the fruits of her gathering. And if you look carefully, you'll see what looks like kind of a modern-day watermelon, except it's about the size of her fist. That's called a tamamelon. And over here are some roots, and if you look carefully, this is the digging stick that she used to dig those roots up. Here's some gruya berries. And right here in the middle, for those folks up front, you can see this is a tortoise. So she got both plant and animal foods when she was out gathering. And of course the men are sitting in the background doing absolutely nothing while she brings home the food. This photograph is kind of interesting because what Richard Lee wanted to do, he wanted to see if these Kung people could actually butcher an antelope with a stone tool. So if you look carefully, a hand axe that was built, these things were made starting about 1.5 million years ago. They wanted to see if they could actually butcher it, and indeed they could. So what is some other evidence to show that all of the hominid species that we looked at on that second slide, that they were omnivorous. We could look at the diet of our closest living ancestor, chimpanzee, and this is a photograph Richard Wrangham at Harvard gave me, and you can see here that there's two male chimps, and they've killed antelope, and they are disarticulating it with their hands. So it's real difficult because they don't have large carnassial teeth to tear it up like a big cat. So they have to do it with their hands, and it takes them quite a while to ultimately eat everything. And they do go into the skull, and they put their finger through the foramen magnum and pull out brains and eat those, which we'll show you here maybe later in this lecture how eating brains might have been a good thing. So about 65 grams of meat a day during the dry season. Okay, what is some other evidence to show that all of these hominids were omnivorous? This is stable isotope data from Julia Leethorpe and Matt Sponheimer. He's at CU. She's at the University of South Africa. And what this is, it's a measurement of an isotope called delta 13 carbon. And you can see right here we have more C3. These are C3 plants. And what C3 plants are, they're herbs and shrubs and leaves and berries and so forth, whereas C4 plants are basically grasses and sedges. And so if you look at the isotopic signature of a grazer, or an animal that eats grass, you can see it has more C3, so it has a less negative delta 13 carbon signature. And so this is what we see. If we look at a browser, an antelope or an animal that consumes leaves and berries and fruits and whatever, it leaves this signature. Now what I want you to look at is look at the signature of an obligate carnivore. Here's a leopard right here, and here's an extinct saber-toothed cat. And so notice that they have a mixed signal. And the reason that they do it, well, they don't eat any plant foods at all. The reason that they have that mixed signal is because they're eating the flesh of animals that are either grazers or browsers. And so if we look at the early hominids, if you look at Homo and Paranthropus and Australopithecus, which are these blue ones, you can see that they also have a mixed signal as well. So no living ape eats grasses, and they're indigestible because they contain high amounts of cellulose, and we don't have the enzyme. No mammal has the enzyme cellulase to break down cellulose. So the way that you can break cellulose down is by evolving a large hindgut where you can ferment the cellulose. We don't do that. No primates do that, except for, well, there's a baboon over here that does it, and you can see this is this baboon right here, Theropithecus. So it's the only one that does it, and it ferments the grasses in the hindgut. So I just published a paper, and maybe some of you have seen it in the Proceedings of the National Academy, in which we actually rebutted the popular press suggesting that grain eating had been done millions of years ago. It wasn't, and this is the evidence for it. So the uncertain, this is what comes up during that Paleo-Pleistocene period, is how much plant food and how much animal food were all those 20 species consuming. Well, we really don't have a good data set to say one way or the other. One thing that we can say is starting in about 2.5 million years ago, maybe even earlier, maybe even 3.5 million years ago, they were consuming more and more animal foods in their diet. So let's see what that evidence is. Starting at about 2.5 million years ago, we see the very first lithic technology, and this is called the Old Dalwan tool tradition, and it appears in East Africa, Ethiopia, about 2.5, 2.6 million years ago. And there are two parts to these tools. If you look carefully, this fellow up here, that's actually Dr. Sama, and he was the discoverer of these tools, and he's the guy that dated them. There's two parts to them. There's a core, and there's sharp flakes. And so you can see those sharp flakes, and modern-day experiments have shown that these flakes are very effective at disarticulating and butchering large animals. And the core can be used to crack open the skull and get at brains. And as I mentioned, brains are a very good source of arachidonic acid and DHA. And so nervous tissue and brain requires a source of AA or DHA to be healthy and to actually synthesize nervous tissue. And then you can see here the core can also be put on a hammerstone and crack open marrow. Marrow doesn't have very many long-chain fatty acids, but it's got a ton of triglyceride in the form of monounsaturated fats, kind of like nuts or olive oil. So in the archaeologic record, this is what we call a smoking gun. And this paper was published in Science in 1999. And if you look carefully, let's take a look over here on the left-hand side of the slide, and you can see there's a scratch mark on the medial surface of the jaw. And if we magnify that and then actually look at the scratch through scanning electron microscopy, what appears is not just a random scratch, but a deliberate cut. And we know this wasn't made by gnawing of carnivores or random rocks rolling around with a fossil in a creek bed, because it leaves a very distinctive cut. And so what they were interested in doing, if this is the medial surface of the jaw, what organ do you think they were going after? Tongue, yeah, exactly. They were going after the tongue. And so our group actually have gone in and looked at the fatty acid composition of the tongue in wild animals, and it turns out that tongue is also high in monounsaturated fats like marrow. And for modern humans, monounsaturated fat from animals tastes good. So Plains Indians like to make their pemmican out of marrow rather than storage fat because it has more monounsaturated fats and it tastes better to us. And over here you can see these percussion marks showing that they extracted marrow from these long bones. Okay, there's also additional evidence to suggest that during that Paleo-Pleistocene period, our ancient ancestors were consuming more and more animal food, and this is called the expensive tissue hypothesis, put forth first by Leslie Aiello in 1995. And if we look at the brain size of modern humans, we have these huge brains, yet we have a gut that is much smaller than what would be expected for an equivalent 60-kilo primate. And so that's really the essence of this idea, is that brain is the most metabolically active tissue in our entire bodies. And it takes up about 9 times more watts of energy as we're just sitting here than any other organ combined. So 9 times more energy is devoted to driving the brain. And so if our bodies were all brain, if our entire bodies were brain, think about what our metabolic rate would be. It would be absolutely enormous. So as we evolve a large brain, then the expectation would be that the overall metabolic rate would be greater than what would be expected for a primate. But it turns out that wasn't true, is the overall metabolic rate was exactly as predicted. And so then what happened, as we evolved a large brain, our guts shrank. And so what is the interpretation of that? Is that when we were eating a diet more like our chimp ancestors, primarily of fruit, it took a very large metabolically active gut to digest all of that fiber. And once we started shifting over to eating more and more calorically dense fats and brains and meat, then it allowed for the selection of a smaller gut because there was absolutely no negative selective pressures with doing that. There's other evidence as well to show that we were consuming more and more meat in our diet, and one of that is the very first members of our genus Homo appear in Africa roughly 2 million years ago, and they made it all the way up to 40 degrees north latitude by at least 1.8 million years ago. And I come from Colorado, and we're at about 40 degrees north latitude. We're also a little bit higher elevation. But starting in around November, the ground is frozen, and there's virtually no plant foods that are available. And hunter-gatherers don't store things, so what that means is they had to have developed the behavior to eat and kill and scavenge animal food at the lower latitudes. So that's also suggestive that making it up to this high latitude, even during the interglacial periods when Europe and Asia were warm, they still had cold seasons. So it is also indicative they were eating more and more animal foods. This is an idea that our group had and came up with in 2002, and we contrasted the metabolism of cats, which are obligate carnivores, to humans. And cats have made a number of evolutionary adaptations to their all-meat diet. And first off, cats can't synthesize taurine. It's a conditionally essential amino acid that all cells have to have for optimal function. And so cats simply can't do it. They've lost, there's an enzyme that the liver makes that allows it to take precursor amino acids and turn them into taurine. And so cats have got a defect in the gene that builds that enzyme, and they can't do it. But there's absolutely no consequences. So they still have very high taurine levels. Taurine is only found in animal foods. It's not found in plant foods. So where did they get it? They got it pre-formed. You eat animal foods, and you lose the ability to make taurine. Humans, if we feed infants formula, which we did back in the 70s and 80s, that is devoid of taurine, their plasma concentrations of taurine decrease. If you decide to become a vegan vegetarian, your plasma concentrations of taurine as well as urinary concentrations will decrease because it is suggestive that that enzyme that we have also, not like cats, we haven't completely lost the ability, but we don't do very well. And similarly, we can look at all these other enzymes and pathways, and what they tell us is that cats, because they're getting these items, these nutritional items pre-formed, it doesn't matter whether they lose the ability to synthesize or not synthesize. So here's a good one right here, is beta-carotene. We can make beta-carotene in liver, or vitamin A from beta-carotene in the diet, but cats can't do that at all. They simply become very deficient and ultimately die. So that process in humans is inefficient. So what can we say? We're not obligate carnivores, but we've moved down that metabolic pathway towards eating more and more animal foods. So the question comes up then is how much plant food and how much animal food were actually consumed in these ancient diets. And so there really is no answer. It's kind of like, well, is there a single paleo diet? No, there's a variety of plant-animal food subsistence ratios. And that's what our group actually went in and analyzed. We analyzed what's called the ethnographic data. And ethnographic data is historical data that has been published by people that went out in the field, looked at hunter-gatherers, frontier doctors, and they made notes about these folks. So it's pretty loose data. It's not randomized controlled trial. It's not empirical. It's more subjective. But anyway, it's the only data that we have. So we went in and reanalyzed the 229 hunter-gatherer societies that were reported in the ethnographic atlas. And here's what our data showed, is that if we looked at the subsistence dependence on gathered plant foods, there were, as I mentioned, 229 hunter-gatherer societies. And these little blocks here are called class intervals. So 0 to 5% plant food, all the way up to 86 to 100% plant foods. And the statistical analysis, what we did is we looked at the mode, which is the most frequently occurring value, 26 to 35% plant food, and the median, the value at which the numbers half fall above and half fall below, is the median, and that was found in the same class interval, 26 to 35%. So basically that's indicative of what the average hunter-gatherer was doing in terms of plant foods. About a quarter to a third of their calories came from plant foods. And if you notice up here, there was not a single vegetarian or vegan society of all 229, and only 13.5% of these hunter-gatherer societies had greater than 50% of their calories from plant foods. So at least the ethnographic data is supportive of the notion that we were eating more animal foods, and that's included both hunted and fished and gathered as well, animal foods. And so you can see here that the representative value, the mode and the median, falls in this 55 to 65%. So a little more than half of the calories to two-thirds seem to typically come. But once again, as I mentioned, this is really kind of soft data. Ethnographic data is not empirically based. And so there's lots of room for error here. And we did actually compile the hunter-gatherer data in which we have quantitative studies. And I can tell you the photographs that I've looked at from this time period, look at how ripped these guys are. Look at those six-pack abs. So that's pretty characteristic of our ancestors that weren't eating processed foods. So this is a paper we published in 2002 in European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and we actually compiled the 13 quantitative studies in which people had gone into the field, they measured the amount of food, the weight, then they went back, they got the caloric values for those wild plant foods, and then they made a fairly good estimate. And notice here that the numbers we see are about 70% animal, 30% plant. But when we eliminate the very far north societies, the Eskimos and the Inuit that live above, or the Nunavut that live above 60 degrees north latitude, well, they have no choice but to eat only animal food most of the year. When we eliminate those, we see a number then that approaches the ethnographic numbers of about 1/3 to plant food to 2/3 animal food. This is my colleague Mike Richards' work. He was at Oxford when he did this study, and he examined another isotope that is found in the collagen of these fossils, if the collagen is intact, and he compared Neanderthal delta 15 nitrogen in two examples of Neanderthal, two specimens, and he contrasted them to fossils that are found alongside the Neanderthals, so we know they're from the same time frame, a wolf, an Arctic fox, and then here's some herbivores that they find, and you can see that the signature of the Neanderthals indicates that they were eating a ton of protein from animal food. Well, Neanderthals aren't us. That's a different species, and so they were living in Europe during very cold periods. So let's take a look at the data. Let's go fast forward in time to England, and this data comes from about 10 or 12,000 years ago. You can see it was dated in a place called Gough's Cave in England 12,300 years ago. And once again, the same delta 15 nitrogen of these, and these are modern day humans. They were exactly like us. No difference, exactly like us. And you can see that they, again, were having a signature that was even greater than an Arctic fox, but nothing like a deer, a horse, or an auroch. Aurochs are the animals we domesticated to become cows. All right, so this is the known. If we look at the Paleo-Pleistocene period that we talked about, these are the foods that simply couldn't have been consumed because they didn't have the technology to make these highly processed foods that are essentially form 70% of the calories in our diet. So one thing that's kind of interesting, and I give interviews to the media and the press all the time, is that the average person on the street is unaware that we eat the same four things every day, day in and day out, okay? And so 70% of our calories comes from refined vegetable oils, cereal grains, refined sugars, and dairy products. If you eliminate those, then what's left? And I'll show you here in a minute. So every single day of the life of the average American, they eat those foods in processed forms in one way or another. So this is another way of looking at this. And so I've deliberately made this pie chart in which those four food groups, dairy, grains, refined oils, and refined sugars, are in white because they're they're poor in nutrient density. And so what they do is they displace the more colorful foods. And you can see here that meats and fish and nuts and fruits and veggies then are very nutrient dense. And what I'm suggesting people ought to do is with modern foods or with a modern diet, eliminate these foods so that you allow all of these nutrient dense foods to fill in. Here's another way of looking at the Western diet. We can talk about how, as it evolved, and the Neolithic was the first major change. Once we no longer were hunter-gatherers, but were farmers, this was the Neolithic period from 10,000 to about 5,500 years ago. This is when things really started to change. We started to domesticate animals, we started to domesticate cereal grains, we settled down in villages. And even though 10,000 years ago seems to be historically remote, if you look on it from an evolutionary time scale, notice that 10,000 years is really very, very small in terms of human generations. Only 333 human generations have come and gone since agriculture began in the Middle East. And for most of us, it's even shorter still. Most people of Northern European ancestry, agriculture didn't come into play until about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Okay, if we move even faster forward, we can look at the industrial era, which started about 200 years ago. And this is when things really got geared up in terms of processing foods. Sucrose really wasn't available to the average citizen until about 200 years ago with the advent of the steam engine and being able to get sugarcane from the tropics back up to northern latitudes and do it inexpensively. So this is when people could start eating refined sugar in high quantities. Feedlot-produced beef were only made possible with the advent of steam locomotives in which you could get cows to market along with huge amounts of grain and put them into a feedlot. So this is, you can see, less than 5 human generations since we started making beef that looks like it does now. Refined grains are very recent in our diet because the machinery to make refined grains, steel roller mills, didn't exist until the 1880s. Vegetable oils, hydrogenated oils, and most people in this crowd are old enough to remember a time, or many people are, when we didn't put high fructose corn syrup into our diet. This is kind of a fun one, and I've got a little mini paper, and it shows pretty much the advent of junk food. So believe it or not, there actually was a time when we didn't have Hershey's chocolate bars at the supermarket. And there's a couple of ones here that are kind of fun. Here's M&M's 1941. I remember coaching, being an assistant coach on a women's swim team. We'd go on break. You'd have to go to the bathroom, go into a service station, and they'd empty out the candy machine. You know, girls at that age, they're swimmers. They were just absolutely craving these refined sugars. So look at that, 1913, an Oreo cookie. I can't believe that they had invented those. They'll never go away, though, you know. Okay, so when you look at this thing in its entirety, and you look at the Neolithic and the industrial era foods and what they do, they displace all those other healthy foods. But in a couple of papers that we've examined the nutrient content, you can see what's going on here. It disrupts these nutritional factors, these major nutritional factors: the glycemic load, the fatty acid balance, the macronutrient balance, and I'll talk about how all of these things changed. Trace nutrients, vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, acid base, sodium, potassium, and fiber. And to this list, as Alex had mentioned, you can probably talk about anti-nutrients, because the typical Western diet contains high levels of anti-nutrients, and in the swan song of my career, that's what I've been focusing on, is how anti-nutrients disrupt the gut biome and predispose us for autoimmune disease. But that's another lecture. Okay, so let's take a look at cereal grains. You know, cereal grains are the staff of life, and hunter-gatherers didn't eat cereal grains, and so they comprise roughly a quarter of the calories in the typical Western or U.S. diet. Unfortunately, we eat our cereal grains as refined grains rather than whole grains. Am I saying whole grains is a better idea? Not necessarily. There's trade-offs with both of them. So what are grains? The seeds of grasses. And in their wild state, they're typically very small, difficult to harvest, and they're really indigestible unless you grind them down and then cook them. So that's what you have to do to make them edible. And with hunter-gatherers, they didn't like to do that. There's a concept called optimal foraging theory, in which they're trying to get the most bang for the buck. So the amount of energy that they expend has to be equivalent to what they get back. And if you got to put all this processing energy into eating it, then they become starvation foods. So the appearance of these are called saddle stones, these crude grindstones in the Middle East, roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago, heralds the beginning of humanity's use of cereal grains as staples. And once again, we published a little rebuttal in the Proceedings of the National Academy, and then we published a more extensive paper. My colleagues, Pedro and Melan, who will be speaking to you later on, we wrote a little bit larger article on this notion and rebutting the idea that people were eating grass, seeds, and grains way, way back. So up until about 1880, this is how cereals were milled. You can see here's a woman still started about 2,500 years ago. We invented water wheels so that we could turn these great big heavy stones with the force of a machine. And the inherent difference with the new technique is that these things grind the entire seed together. So the endosperm, the germ, the bran, they all are in the flour. And unless you go through another step to remove them, then that's how bread and flour were made until, for the average person, until the 1880s. In the 1880s, steel roller mills came into play, and they fundamentally break the wheat berry differently. They squeeze the wheat berry, so they squeeze the germ out of it, and then it's very easy to sieve off the germ and the fiber and have nothing left but the endosperm. And when you do that, what it does is it creates a flour that is very, very fine and has a high glycemic index. And so in this chart right here, you can see you can start off with a whole wheat kernel, and it has a very low glycemic index. And the more and more fiber and bran we take out, the higher the glycemic load becomes. So we produce this nice, beautiful, white, uniform flour, but physiologically we do all kinds of damage to our bodies. And in 1880 and 1900, the glycemic index was still 100 years in the future, so we didn't understand what it was we were doing. And as you can see here, virtually all processed foods that are made with grains, whether it's wheat or corn or rice or you name it, they typically have high glycemic indices and high glycemic loads. This is my colleague Jenny Brand-Miller's work, and she published this stuff, and she continues to do so. And so she arbitrarily drew a line in the sand and said that medium glycemic index foods are between 55 and 70. I don't agree with that, so I've been down to Australia a few times, and I think more importantly it's the glycemic load. So it's the glycemic index times the amount of carbohydrate, not in a standard portion, but in an equivalent portion. So I think you have to look at an equivalent portion to make the playing fields level. So this is David Ludwig's work and Seaman Lew's, and this is some of the earlier stuff that really kind of told the public a few vitamins. We call it enriching it. And so after World War II, these B vitamins, B1, 2, and 3 were enriched, as well as iron, and I'll show you that on the next slide. And then starting in 1998, we put folic acid into all refined grains. But paradoxically, folic acid didn't exist until 1948. Nobody on the planet ever ate folic acid until 1948 when chemists at Leaderly Labs synthesized the compound. Folic acid and folate are not the same compound. So when we eat refined grains, you can see then that we're knocking the hell out of folate, and this is what's left, and then we replace it with folic acid. And the reason that that was done is that it was thought, well, folic acid, the liver turns folic acid into folate, and it was thought that this would reduce the number of neural tube defects, actually mortality from neural tube defects. And we published a paper showing that, yeah, it did, but was it significant? We put 300 million people at risk by supplementing our diet with folic acid to save roughly 150 lives. Okay, so that's why it was done. And there was only one other country that followed lockstep with the United States, and that was Canada. So none of the European countries decided to do that because there was experimental work at the time suggesting that this isn't a very good thing to do. And what we have seen in the decade and a half since the folic acid supplementation program is an increase in multiple epithelial cell cancers. And so there's some really good randomized controlled trials in which they give people, men in particular, folic acid, because folic acid also is supposed to reduce cardiovascular disease. And it turns out is what happens is that prostate cancer morbidity and mortality rose dramatically. And in animal models, we now have a mechanism of how this might work. So this, to my way of thinking, is going to turn into an enormous public health blunder that hopefully will be reversed in the not too near future. So mineral depletion occurs also when we refine our grains, and you can see here that virtually all minerals are, are reduced when you consume a whole grain from a refined grain, but this is misleading because in vivo, in the body, it doesn't work this way. So what happens is most of these divalent ions, iron and zinc and manganese, and all of these are bound to phytate in a dose-dependent manner, meaning that we don't absorb them anyway. So when we eat whole grains, we get probably even less iron than what we would get with fortified iron. So it's, as I mentioned, there's a trade-off here. And the other trade-off is that whole grains are a much more concentrated source of anti-nutrients, which Pedro Bastos will be talking to you about later in the morning. So there's a variety of diseases then that are associated with the reduced fiber content. And one of the common questions that come up when people adopt paleo diet, that they say, how am I ever going to get my fiber if I reduce all of these whole grains? Well, you can see that on a per caloric basis here, whole grains are a pretty poor source of fiber. And the types of fiber that tends to have therapeutic effects in our body, soluble fiber versus non-soluble fiber, except for oats, grains don't have a whole lot of this. Whereas you can see here, fruits and vegetables are wonderful sources of fiber. And if you take these things out of your diet, you get plenty of fiber. So how do we know that dairy products couldn't have been consumed? So end of story, right? Somebody on the popular press calls me. I said, have you ever been close to a wild animal? No. Have you ever tried to milk a wild animal? Okay. So you have to domesticate animals before you can milk them. So that didn't happen until about 10,000 years ago. You can see this is the content of dairy products in the typical Western and U.S. diet, about 10% of total energy. And this is data in which they actually look at the fatty acid composition on pottery shards, and they can see that indeed that fatty acid composition comes from milk and dairy products. And so first dairying evidence comes from the Middle East about 9,000 years ago. We see it in Great Britain about 6,000 years ago. All right, one of the ideas that got me interested early on, and once again, the idea came for it, as Alex kind of mentioned, from this paleo template, and it led me to not just rheumatoid arthritis, but it led me to many other health problems. And so I take this evolutionary template and I place it over that whole idea. And so we were some of the first people to blow the horn on diet and acne in the American Medical Association's flagship journal, the Archives of Dermatology, and that was 10 or 15 years ago. So what led me to that was the same thing that led me to the rheumatoid arthritis that has now led me to autoimmune disease, was this evolutionary template. And you can see here is that if we look at the glycemic index of milk products, they're very, very low. Okay? They're very, very low. So in theory, they ought to be pretty good for insulin and glucose metabolism. Yet if we look at the insulin response, it's like eating cookies or white bread or sugar. So paradoxically, the glycemic response and the insulin response have been disassociated. And we were the second group internationally to point this out. It's my graduate student, Garrett Hoyt. And indeed, we saw this effect, and it was shown earlier by Jenny Brand Miller's group and a few other folks. So the question comes up then, is that a detrimental effect? So some people have suggested that a low glycemic load and a high insulin response might be therapeutic. Animal models of that show that's not the case. So if you ever go to an Italian restaurant and you order up veal, okay, what is veal? It's calves, very small cows, that have been intensely fed milk over the first couple of months of their life, and then they're slaughtered. And so this is well known in the animal science community that doing that, feeding high milk diets, way beyond what they could ever get from suckling from their mother, so essentially force feeding them milk, causes insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, and these other problems. So there's only been one study in the clinical literature with humans. This is Kristen Hoppy's group, and she reported in AJCN in 2005 that if you gave these young boys their protein as either milk or meat during the arm of the study in which they were fed milk, they all became insulin resistant. So we need to replicate this study in adults, and I have colleagues that are on the process, hopefully, of doing this shortly. Okay, so we ate wild animal foods, which are, it's really not practical to do that anymore, but what are the changes that occur in the nutrient content of animal foods as we go down the line here, from wild to grass-produced to grain-produced? So our ancestors ate everything. They ate the entire carcass, whereas what we eat is simply the muscle meat. When we talk about meat, that's what we eat. And most typically, it's grain-produced or processed. And so here you can see, if we look at the fat content by energy, not by weight, of America's favorite meats, you can see they're really not meat at all. They're fat disguised as meat. So very high fat concentration in these, and it doesn't look anything like wild animals, and we've done those experiments. We've actually done that. And in wild animals, the body fat content waxes and wanes seasonally. Yet once we domesticated animals, we could provision them with food, and we weren't stupid. We slaughtered them when they were at peak fat content because we could do that. We're at the mercy with wild animals. Whatever fat they have is the fat they have. And so this represents the change in body fat in caribou over the course of a 12-month period, and this is fairly reminiscent of not just North American, but also European and African mammals that humans would have preyed on. So you can see that the body fat over the course of 7 months is quite low. It's about 3 or 4%. Anybody that knows about body fat realizes that in humans this is a very, very low value. And in North America, only during the fall, and that's why we have hunting seasons in the fall, does the body fat increase. So we did these experiments a decade ago, and we analyzed the total fat and the fatty acid content in wild animals, grass-produced animals, and grain-produced animals. And you can see here that the amount of fat in this feedlot cattle is an order of magnitude higher. And you don't have to be a scientist to do the analysis. Look at the differences in the carcass. There's no subcutaneous fat here, whereas these guys have 3 and 4 and 5 inches. And the triglyceride infiltrates the muscles here, and you don't have that with wild animals. So it wasn't until about 150 years ago that we started to do this, started to feed cows grains, and it fundamentally altered a couple of factors. It changed the fatty acid balance, it reduced the omega-3 content, it reduced the macronutrient balance. Now we're producing a meat that contains a lot less protein, and because there are less vitamins and minerals in fat than there are in protein, we reduce the nutrient content as well with that process. This just contrasts the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids between grass and grain-produced animals. And the big problem here is the high levels of linoleic acid. So you can see we have maybe 50 or 60% more linoleic acid, and that does represent a problem. I will try to finish up here on time. At 9 o'clock, we'll take a short little break, and then I'll come back and do my second one. So potentially, we can at least add to the amount of omega-3s in our diet by eating grass-fed. The amount of omega-3s that we need are roughly 10 times higher than what you would get from a quarter gram serving here. So these are part of the solution and not part of the problem, but they don't cure the problem, and I'll talk to you how we'll do that later. Okay, added salt is rarely consumed. We eat about 10 grams of salt. Primarily, you can see from processed food, a little bit from cooking, and very little in naturally occurring foods. This is a mountain of salt found in Catalonia, Spain, and when I went over and spoke to my friends Melan and Pedro and showed this slide, about half the audience put their hand up and said, I know where that place is. They've actually seen that mountain. So salt was rarely used by hunter-gatherers. Perhaps those living close to the ocean may have dipped their food in salt water, but inland hunter-gatherers, there's really no precedence for it. And here's the laundry list of diseases that are associated with the high salt content. Here's one, as practitioners, you may not know. This comes from an obscure paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 1944. And if you have patients that aren't sleeping well, get the salt out of their diet. Another one that comes from our group is exercise-induced asthma. We blew the whistle on that a number of years ago. And let's talk about refined sugars. Depending on whose numbers you're looking at, anywhere from 15 to 20% of total calories. This is USDA disposal data. This is where it comes from. It's changed a little bit over the course of the year. Hunter-gatherers are hardwired for sweets and fatty foods. Their brains seek it out because it has survival value, but they couldn't eat it in unlimited quantities. So honey would have always been consumed, but it was only available seasonally. This is good per capita disposal data out of Europe showing that prior to the agricultural revolution, hardly anybody in Europe ate sugar, so dentists were out of business. This is data from England, and you can see then that except for the two world wars, sugar consumption rose steadily until about 1970. This is data from the United States for the last 100 years or so. And we've actually made a little bit of inroads into refined sugar consumption. It peaked in 2000, and over the last decade, it started to decline a little bit. There was a fundamental change made in the types of sugars that we were consuming prior to the advent of high fructose corn syrup being made with this technology that you see up here. Most of the sugar came from sucrose. So is there any difference between sucrose and fructose in terms of how it influences our body? A little bit. Okay, so one is a compound, and one or two elements. So we have an enzyme in our gut to break sucrose into glucose and fructose. So it may be a little bit less problematic, but probably not much. So you can see then that this is our data. High fructose corn syrup has increased dramatically over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, and this parallels nicely the obesity epidemic in the United States. And so many people think that fructose underlies part of the problem. I don't think it's the only problem, but I think it certainly is part of it. So you can see then that it all peaked in about 2000. As I mentioned, fructose and sucrose have similar effects in the body, but not identical. So here's some of the diseases that are associated. Obviously, dental caries. Any society that consumes high amounts of sugar typically ends up with dental caries. There are individuals that seem to be resistant, but as a population, most don't do so well. The metabolic syndrome now is very well characterized, and also epithelial cell cancers through mechanisms that we outlined in 2004 that are now fairly well recognized, is that breast, colon, and prostate cancer all tend to be promoted via the hormonal cascade that insulin resistance produces. Okay, vegetable oils, they comprise about 18% of total calories, and we use these in all kinds of processed foods. And you can see how they're broken down. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the only way to make these things was by rendering and pressing. And so the first oils that were made were traditional olive oils and flax oils and what have you. Most of the oils were used for lubrication and not as food oils. And so starting in the last century or so, you can see this machine up here. This is a steel expeller, and it creates an enormous amount of pressure, and it can extract oils out of seeds that you eat, like corn. Corn doesn't seem like it's an oily food, but it can extract oil out of them, and then by using purification procedures and solvents and so forth, you can get all of these non-traditional oils and put them into your diet. The hydrogenation process was invented in 1897 so that we could harden them, turn them into margarine and other shortening and other fats. And this is the first time we end up with a specific type of fat, transelaic acid, in our diet. And transelaic acid seems to cause multiple adverse effects. This is the per capita consumption of refined vegetable oils in the United States. And you can see, starting in about 1900, we did practically very little at all, and we almost increased that by 500% since the year 2000. I'll tell you one little anecdotal story here, and then we'll call it quits, take a little break, and come back and do the next lecture. But my grandfather moved out to California, Southern California, in the 1920s, and he started a restaurant in Hollywood. And so his restaurant served probably about 200 or 300 people maybe. And after he died in the 40s, my mother inherited all his stuff, and one of the things she got was a cookbook that he had purchased back in 1913. That's when it was dated, and it was a cookbook and a recipe on how to cook for 300 people. And so I ultimately got that after my mother passed away, and I went through that recipe book, and the only oil in the entire recipe book was olive oil, and there were very few recipes that used it. They used lard and other fats, but they certainly didn't use anything near to what we use now. So in that time frame, just in the 3 generations that I've lived, this has gone from practically nothing in our diet to 20% of our calories. So what are the problems with consuming high amounts of processed foods and refined vegetable oils? It alters the fatty acid balance in our diet, and most of these vegetable oils are very high in an 18-carbon fatty acid called linoleic acid. And it used to be thought that linoleic acid was a good thing. And there's still, it's somewhat controversial in the scientific literature, but not to my way of thinking. And so this actually, it was thought to lower blood cholesterol and reduce the risk for heart disease. But reanalysis of some of the classic studies by Joe Hibbelin and other folks in our group showed exactly the opposite. And so linoleic acid tends to be pro-inflammatory. So this is a bad thing. So if you've got, and guess what? Inflammation drives all chronic disease. You can't have heart disease, you can't have cancer, and you can't have autoimmunity without upregulation of the pro-inflammatory response. So this is involved in that problem, and that's why you can see it is associated with all those diseases. So in all of their brilliance, the USDA came up with a new thing. They went from the food pyramid to my plate. But for me, it was even easier to zap this one. All I had to do is put an X over here and an X here, and now we're kind of back to paleo. So there's some fundamental differences we have with that, but this is what I think people ought to try to do, is you should emulate not exactly or precisely the diets of hunter-gatherers. We can't do that, and I'll show you in the next lecture how it's impossible. But what we should try to do is to emulate the food groups that they consumed and eliminate the food groups that they didn't consume. So this is what I think we ought to do. Thank you. Then the next lecture is a little bit shorter, so why don't we take a 5 to 7 minute break, try to be back here between 5 after and 10 after, and we'll get going on the next lecture, and hopefully have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of all these lectures.